Ladies and gentlemen, in probability, this evening when you're handed a delicious steak or Thai food or whatever your contingent dinner is, you don't fully understand the consequences of your action of either ordering that meal or eating it. Now, it'd be very easy for me to get up here and tell you, Indonesian live exports and all these sorts of things are really bad, and we should feel sorry for the cows and all these individuals. But the fact is that even in Australia today, even with the best meat code practices, you still have inhumane procedures and people do not know about them. One of the most common ways to slaughter a cow in Australia is a process known as exsanguination. What happens is that you strap a cow into a large metal tip, and what you do is you get a big spike and drive it into its skull. Now this is the interesting bit. It doesn't kill it straight away. What it actually does is it just paralyses its spinal cord. This means that its heart keeps beating for another hour to pump the blood out of its body, because stale blood makes meat taste bad. That is how far we are willing to go as Australians to make sure that the steak on the barbecue tastes nice. And to be honest, we think that's a little too far. Or moreover, we want people to fully understand the consequences of what they're getting themselves into when they go for the steak challenge at the pub, ladies and gentlemen. And that is why we have this model. We are going to be showing ads that show graphic footage of how meat is slaughtered, how it is produced, and the after effects of the consumption, as my second speaker will discuss later in his speech. We believe this is consistent with past government programs on how social utility should be measured against individual freedom and freedom of choice. We think this is very consistent. So, with this consistency in mind, let's discuss two main issues. Firstly, why is the role of the government to force individuals to understand the broader ramifications of their actions? And secondly, how are we going to denormalise meat culture, specifically in Australia? So firstly, why is it the government's role to infringe on freedom? There are two reasons for this. Firstly, if there is a lack of information out there in the very first place. The fact that some of you look surprised when I told you about the exsanguination thing, as I did when I first heard it, tells us that not many people know about how Australian meat is done and how meat in the world practices are done like that. Specifically, the government also has a role to intervene and tell people things when the decision causes great significant harm. We acknowledge that individuals on this side of the house have a right to eat meat if they wish, but because of the social ramifications of that action, they need to validate and legitimise that decision by making sure that they've made the calculus themselves. There is no calculus at this point, ladies and gentlemen, unless you're a particularly keen and active person in seeing how your food has gotten to the dinner table, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we are happy to make sure that individuals think about this limitation of their freedom when you have such great social utility to consider and quantify, as I will later in my speech and as Tom will in his substantive. So, as I said already, we respect individuals' right to choose what food they get, and also their respect to differentiate things based on their cognitive capacity. We're not saying that cows are as warm and feely and intelligent as humans or anything as such. However, it is true to say that an adult pig has the same IQ as a 3-year-old adult. Again, these are facts that simply aren't out there in the mainstream media, and there is a myth, a myth that is propagated out there, that these animals, this Abrahamic myth of these animals were put there for humanity to use and for humanity to exploit. And this is something deeply ingrained, particularly in Western culture, and something that we want to change with the behavioural advertisements that we're putting out there to make sure that people have a visceral shock to these sorts of things in the very first place, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we're going to educate individuals about the consequences of their actions. So let's think about chickens, for example. Why restrict ourselves to the world of bovine products? Let's have a look at how chickens are farmed intensively, one of the world's most successful animals, because they taste delicious and we want lots of them. Battering hens, ladies and gentlemen, are one of the most cruel and callous blights on the modern food processing industry. What you have is dozens and dozens of layers of hens stuck together in cramped conditions that their wings are malformed because they're unable to exercise. Most of the chickens no longer have feathers because of the fact that if you're on the bottom rung, the feces of the other chickens fall on you. The acidity of that means that not only do your feathers fall off, but your legs wither away into stumps, ladies and gentlemen. And no one cares, because in the end, they can be manufactured and processed for other, good or something like that. We want to alert people to the significant harms that these sorts of things cause. If you see that and go, look, it doesn't outweigh the benefit I'm going to get from having a McNugget tonight, that's fine by us. But we think that a vast majority of individuals who are rational, who are compassionate, will reconsider their eating behaviour and their dietary requirements. And that is exactly the sort of behaviour and incentives that we want to change on this side of the house in the very first place. That is the reason for it. We also believe that we, as people seeing these advertisements, can have significant advantages in a number of areas. The number one killer in Australia, surprisingly enough, is not starvation from a lack of meat. It is problems associated with an overconsumption, particularly of red meat. We look at things like the stunningly high bowel and stomach cancer rates and heart disease, and the excessive results of eating fatty meat can provide for these individuals. Again, if you value your steak that much, you want to cut some years off your life, fine, think about it before you do it first. That is our stance on this side of the house. We believe this principle is already established, for instance, in the regulation of cigarettes and tobacco. Smoke like a chimney for all we care, but it is the government's role to let you know what exactly you're getting yourself into, because the cigarette company sure as hell aren't going to tell you, and the meat industry sure isn't going to tell you how it got to your table in the very first place, ladies and gentlemen. So, moving on to this next point. Let's have a look at the idea of denormalizing meat culture in Australia. We've got like this fetish around it, the fact that it's so inbuilt into our national identity, that like our national day involves cutting up live animals and then searing them on like a hot plate. Right? This is something that perhaps should be changed or at least reconsidered, because it's quite bizarre. Let's have a look at the status quo. We live under a veil of blissful ignorance, and we want to tear that apart and show people where it came from. It's particularly important in modern society, because you don't, like generations past, you had an acute realisation of where your food came from. Either you or your family members participated in the process of gathering it or hunting it. Under the status quo, you can never even know that, steak comes from a cow and still enjoy the benefits of a Big Mac, ladies and gentlemen. And this, disparity between where the meat comes from and where people know, we want to fix with our model by giving people a visceral reaction, or at least filling in the gaps that has been persisted under the status quo. The odd internet advertisement from Peter isn't really going to cut it. You need continuous advertising, like we're talking about on this side of the house, that will do the changes that we're looking for and the changes that we deserve. We believe, for instance, the shock and controversy that we saw when Four Corners decided to air that program. The fact that the government backflipped on its policy 2 days after that was done shows how people respond when they truly understand the consequences of their actions, and this can create that is the micro-behavioural change that will cause the macro effects that we're discussing on this side of the house, and that's what we want to talk about, and that's why we want to change. Again, if they say it's too hard and we can't do it, absolute rubbish, ladies and gentlemen, they're lying to you. Look at cigarettes. In the 60s, everyone smoked. Look at what we have now. We have some of the lowest cigarette smoking that we've ever seen in human history. And this is particularly important in circumstances where individuals change behaviour that is so ingrained in society, and we can change that not through banning them from smoking or banning them from eating meat, but simply alerting them to the consequences of their actions. And that is the sort of education we want on this side of the house. Because in the end, it comes down to you. Do you want to make the calculus that eating meat is worth the pain and the suffering that we're talking about? Or do you really understand that you have an imperative as a person who has the higher functioning power to consider others? Because if you do, you will listen to our model. Thank you very much.
If it is true that meat is such an essential part of Australian culture that it's built up in nationalism either of a country or a particular ethnic minority, be they Italian, German, Indian, weird, O'Hara, whatever, then it is also true that individuals are not capable of appreciating the ramifications of what has occurred. What the negative team doesn't understand is that when you eat meat every single day and it is on your dinner table, it is very easy to disassociate that consumption from the way in which it got onto the table in the first place. That's what Alex told you, and that's why a government policy, A, is going to change things, but B, even if it doesn't change, we think it's important to force individuals to consider those ramifications. 2 questions. First, do individuals have a right to close themselves off from the social harms they do to other people in society, and how does that sit with the general right to consume meat? Secondly, will we actually denormalise and achieve change? Are we seeing change under the status quo? Firstly, what is the actual rights that individuals have here? We have a lot of rhetoric from the negative team that we are basically it's the government coming along and saying to you, you shouldn't eat meat. You should not eat meat because you're immoral, unethical, whatever. We don't think the education campaigns are necessarily going to be like that, right? Like showing a cow being slaughtered in a brutal way doesn't necessarily involve a government moral judgment. But in any case, who the fuck cares if it does, right? If that means that people have more information about the choices and what the effect their choices have upon other people, that is what is great. And that's what Alex told you at first, right? Just because people have a genuine right to consume meat and animals are not of the same sentience as humans are, doesn't mean you can close yourselves off to those options. When you know about the practices that go into them, you have a more informed decision. Because of the social harms that occur to third parties in a way that you can't ensure happens under the status quo, the government has a role to step in here. That's why it's very similar to gambling and cigarettes. When we saw with cigarettes is huge amounts of individual harms, yes, but also social harms in terms of passive smoking. The problem was you had a culture of smoking ingrained with the Marlboro man walking along with the winning lose or champion in the top pocket and going, hey, smoking is the best. And you cannot change that. You cannot give people information unless the state steps in and forces that information onto people. Even if it involves a subjective moral judgment about eating meat, fantastic, that's great, that's the problem with the status quo, awesome. Secondly, if there is going to be a massive backlash and no one's going to respond, then who cares, right? Like, we prefer to get some marginal benefit in talking to some people about these issues and forcing the meat industry to actually respond to these claims in a systematic way, rather than just every couple of years when Four Corners decides animal rights are awesome. Then we think that's really important. That's why all their analysis about the TAC and other things weren't true, right? It was exactly the same sorts of issues. Secondly, let's talk about denormalization. We've got a lot of material on that. The first thing we heard is that Alex O'Hara just made up words in the dictionary. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish I could say that was true. It's not. What that indicates, though, is that there's only very rare people like Alex and some people in society and certain segments in society who understand how these processes work. I learned a lot in prep about how meat goes from the consumption to the table. The reason why that's the case is that no individual wants to know that what they're doing is morally wrong, right? You don't want to think about the ramifications. That's why every time I debate vegetarianism with my friends Jess and Emily, I think, but it's just really tasty. I don't want to think about the practices that go into it. So when you think to yourself, I am morally illegitimate because of this, you close yourself off to those options. Is there going to be a massive public backlash? We just don't think it's true that the meat industry is going to be able to run this awesome PR campaign pointing out the importance of lamb to Australian culture. Firstly, that is the status quo. That's why Sam Cakovich still has a job despite having no actual labour skills in any of the Second response, though, is that even if the meat industry has to run a public campaign, they have to respond to the claims made by the government, and this is why the fact that it's an image is actually really important. It is so easy to disassociate yourself from the words on the page. I did a debate about animal cruelty 10 years ago when I was in school and still young and actually should be debating at tournaments like this. What that indicates is that the public hasn't changed in its information level. What we heard, the Four Corners example proves that the media can get engaged and do these things. What we saw as a result of that, and I'm going to talk about that in substantive, is people engaged for a split second with subsequent or intermittent media response to these sorts of issues. But people switched off after that. What we saw was government policy being able to backflip from the original backflip of the backflip and go away and continue practices of parting of and continue those practices and sending live exports overseas. Just relying upon the media to occasionally do it doesn't actually get the information out there in the public sphere. That's why there's a role for the state in terms of the market value of information. Yeah, I use an economics word in this debate. Secondly, in terms of substantive, I want to talk about why this improves practices, both in terms of what happens to the ethical treatment of animals, and secondly, why it improves practices with respect to things like usage of land and carbon and all of those sorts of things. Because we think there is a role for meat to still exist in a way that balances individuals' liking of meat and consumption of meat with environmental harms. And I'm going to tell you why that's going to be better under Emily. Firstly, effective and cruel treatment of animals. In the 21st century, we still see processes like battery hens and the really big word that Alex used to explain a really horrible process regarding cows. I'll add one more example. When I was in Paris, I enjoyed consuming shitloads of foie gras, which is one of the most unethical things you could possibly do. You stick a tube down a duck's neck, forcing it to stay in that position for days and days on end, and force feed it to fatten its liver so you could eat the tasty, tasty foie gras at the end of the day. What that means, though, is that we haven't seen any change under the status quo, despite there being some information about there being problems with the ethical treatment of animals. That indicates a problem in getting that information out there. Why is that the case? Lobby groups like PETA are very easily demonised by the meat industry, who is now going to demonise the government as well, according to the opposition's logic. It's much more difficult for these relatively small groups, given that vegetarianism has to fight against meat culture, to establish themselves and advocate for particular change. That's why I think PETA are a bunch of cranks. Secondly, though, public attitudes switch off in those things, and I've already flagged a lot of this issue in substantive when I told you why people stopped paying attention to live exports as soon as it was about 3 weeks after Four Corners decided to talk about it. What does that mean then? It means that despite there being information, you can't change practices for animals. We don't think you necessarily have to stop everyone eating meat in order to get a better outcome for animals. You can do things like not have battery hens, have all the free-range movements that they wanted to talk about, even though that's sort of a very widespread thing, and some people still consume like battery hen eggs because the technology is there and it's more cheaper at the status quo to do so. That's why you need to change people's perceptions and change their buying habits. And none of that happens under the status quo where that information doesn't reach out to people. When you have advertisements that tell you exactly what is going on, that increases public pressure, that increases support for groups like Peter, who now can actually engage with people, as well as the government stepping in and talking about it. Secondly, let's talk about the environmental and kind of physical harms. We think if you showed an advertisement of a starving African child and said to someone, your consumption of meat, your overconsumption of meat is using up the world's resources, and leading to that person not having enough food to put meat on to eat, or maybe eat meat, maybe not, to actually eat day-to-day basis. That indication shows us that the global food crisis is a big deal. When it is much more inefficient to consume meat as where you use grain crops, it is 90% more inefficient than other things. Other science facts that my great team managed to tell me in preparation for this debate. What that means though, is that under the status quo, there's no reason for those practices to change. In Australia, where there are natural advantages to grazing lands, and you can just graze cattle rather than feed them grain, we see better usage of methane, we see better usage and limitation of environmental damage occurring. What you need to do is encourage other countries like the United States to engage in these practices. So as I said before, you can build public support for these sorts of lobbies. Environmental groups have a really hard time explaining exactly what the things are. When you have images about the consequences that happen, you can explain through government advertising campaigns that gives these groups the resources to take their battles to the public sphere, and it puts pressure on the state and political parties to recognise these ideas. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't have an unlimited right to close my eyes and turn around and count to 3 and then hope that the cow's been slaughtered and presented into a wonderful medium rare steak with a nice glass of wine. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
Yes, that was my name.
I recall saying this in a debate before, ladies and gentlemen. What we need now are some facts. We need some science. The science of decision making, it's called economics. The science of how cows are terrible for land, they salinate the fields and they destroy it. The science of how meat is harmful to consumers. And the science of the fact that people do not know what is going on. Knowing something comes from an abattoir is completely different to knowing the word exsanguination, which is like absolutely a brilliant word, as well as like a completely criminal process that we need to get knowledge out about. We need these facts, and we don't just need them to exist, ladies and gentlemen, we need them to be known to everyone. And that is why we need this advertising program. That is why we are having this debate today. So, there have been 3 issues in today's debate. Firstly, did Alex actually say social engineering? And, regardless of that, is it all right? Secondly, the impacts on the calculus of consumers, and I might mention their health in there. And thirdly, the environmental and agricultural impacts, or as I've also labelled it, science. Now, did Alex say social engineering? We're pretty sure he didn't. Their lack of responsiveness indicates they weren't really listening, so we'll assume that's right. But aside from the fact that their quasi-model of regulation is even more social engineering, we think there are some important points here that need to be discussed. So, they've told us we shouldn't force people to see the things they don't want to because the government is presenting a biased moral view. The government is telling its citizens that something is bad and like pursuing that sort of agenda. First of all, let's ask the question, can a government make moral decisions? Yes, we think it does that all the time, particularly when it made the moral decision that it was unethical to ship cows to Indonesia and kill them like that. We think that the government should pass moral judgment on these issues is perfectly fine, and we'd like to know if you're fine with them banning the exports to Indonesia, or why it's at all different. Secondly, can you have biased information? You cannot have biased facts unless they are false facts. However, you can have selective info, and we concede that, and the government will be presenting one side of this argument. But why is that alright? It's alright because the other side, that meat tastes great, is known to everybody in our society. Whereas, if I were to ask the opposition at their third to tell me the CO2 equivalent of carbon emissions of a cow in every year, they will not be able to tell me that it is 4 tons of methane, which is equivalent to 12 tons of CO2. No, that is why the government is able to target specific knowledge. That is why this is justified. So we've been told they sort of like propose regulation without saying it was a sort of model, really unclear. But is regulation also good? Well, first of all, we don't think it's mutually exclusive. So if regulation is beneficial, we can also do it, as well as educating people about meat. But moreover, we think that regulation cannot be the only answer, because people will still be making these choices informed, or rather uninformed, by a lack of information in the society that we have demonstrated throughout our case. Moreover, we think that regulation is not the best way, nor is leaving it up to the industry to do this, to like free-range packets on eggs saying this is good for chicken. But we don't think that this will be enough. We can do that anyway, ladies and gentlemen. Ultimately, it is alright to socially engineer in these circumstances, because all we are doing is presenting information to people, and they haven't told us why that information is dangerous. In fact, Beatrice said a few times that information is all we need, and we agree completely with that. That is why we are proposing that model. So that's why it's perfectly justified to have this sort of like social engineering concept occurring. Okay, so what are going to be the impacts on consumers' calculus? We've been told that this model simply will not work. It won't change anyone's behaviour. So, first of all, they told us that we already know all about this. What they fail to see is the distinction between the sort of knowledge we have and what we don't. So at the moment we have general knowledge. I know that a cow goes to an abattoir, I know it is killed, I know that I eat it, and I know that it tastes brilliant. However, what we don't know is how it is killed. We don't know how it is fed. We don't know how long it is in that abattoir before it is killed. We don't know if it's trussed up before it's killed. We do not know a lot of things, ladies and gentlemen, until Alex O'Hara brought them out at first. So that is the distinction that's important in this debate. This specific knowledge about the process is what's important to the treatment of animals. Because it does not reflect at all on the treatment of animals to say they go to an abattoir. Abattoir is just a word under the A section of the dictionary. It does not mean anything without this specific knowledge. Dictionary bandits, great. So, they secondly told us that people will be persuaded more by people they agree with. And we think that if you agree with someone, yes, that will not change your mind because you also agree with them, but that's not what we're saying. We are saying that it is fine for these people to have polarized opinions. If there are like 10% of the population who like revert to meat and only eat meat and want to eat like 20 kilograms a day, well firstly we think that can't increase too much. You can only eat so much meat, ladies and gentlemen. Look at the steak calories. But moreover, for the rest of society, presenting this information allows them to make this choice. And we think those 10% who choose to eat more meat because they have some fetish for like animal cruelty, that is perfectly fine if that is what they ethically think is alright, which is why we're not making a moral judgment anyway. So why will this actually work? So, we've been told that since people know enough already, which I've told you they don't, then there's no problem, because we've got this discourse at the status quo. Like I go around to my friend's dinner party, and I'm just like, how is this cow killed? The point is, we do not get an understanding or a discourse in our society, except every like 15 years when Peter can afford one ad because no one gets it. Only then can we have like some small discussion about it. But because it's coming from an organisation like Peter, which is affiliated with some sort of what people view as crazy people, we think that that is where it loses legitimacy. Whereas if it's from the government, it comes across as information that is clear, that is concise. Like when they tell you that your lungs will rot, the alveoli in your lungs will be blocked by the tar in the cigarettes. That's the sort of specific knowledge we're alright with, and that's why we think it is so similar to smoking. As for it all being about the practices of killing meat, so it's alright to do it if you do it the way the opposition want, although they haven't told us which way that is. It's about the motivations of individuals. Let's look at the decision-making calculus they will take. So, when we give them this information, they'll be like, okay, exsanguination, apart from being an awesome word, is terrible, so I'll no longer follow, I will look for a company that does not do that. Companies will have an economic incentive to be like, this is how we do it. We will get journalists from 60 Minutes, the purveyors of facts, we'll get them in to explore our factory and understand what is going on, because they have an economic incentive to convey their market to the people we want to influence in this debate. And that's how we will be more effective in changing practices in the industry. So that is the effect it will have on consumers, calculus, ladies and gentlemen. And because that is so good for them, so good for them for this information, and also good for their health, we think that is brilliant. Okay, on to this third issue of the environmental and agricultural impacts. So, we've been told every family needs a farmer by the opposition, but what they don't understand is that we're not abolishing farming. And if people stop eating meat, they will have to eat something, and it's not plastic, ladies and gentlemen. It's called creative destruction in economies, and while people are being attacked for it all the time, it is when we are telling farmers, for instance, that their environmental impact of cows is actually making them worse off in this situation. When the feces of the cows is destroying the ground, when it is going into the subsoil and getting into the trees are dying, ladies and gentlemen. The trees are cleared for the massive amounts of land, the 3 acres per cow, and then you have salt coming up from the water table and destroying that agricultural land that can never be used again. This is massive problems in our society, and we think that they are bigger problems for farmers, and we want to know how you're going to solve them, apart from like having really salty meat. Okay, so because we need to create this economical cost to change and the reputational damage to farmers, we think that this is so important. As for meat being for export markets, we think internationally we can implement our model, and moreover, we're sending this message internationally as well. We think it'll get quite a bit of publicity. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why we need this model.
Ladies and gentlemen, we all heard the first speaker's intro about how cows are being killed in spinning metal dishes and how the legs of chickens are withering into stumps. Now, as bad as this may be, I noticed that not many people in this auditorium fell off their chairs in surprise. This demonstrates the fact that all of you are in here have already heard these things before and that people are actually informed. This shows us that the content of his intro in itself is ineffective. And to further demonstrate that, I'm going to ask a further question. How many people here, after hearing that intro at the beginning of the first speaker's speech, are not going to eat meat tonight? How many of you are actually going to eat meat? The point is here that money that is spent on these advertising campaigns can be better spent on regulation and reform to actually improve the processes. How is any of us here, knowing about these facts, going to directly lead to improved conditions that the first speaker spoke about? So, I'm going to ask two questions of the affirmatives case today. Firstly, will this policy in any meaningful way actually change the amount of people that consume meat? And then secondly, even if it does it ultimately have any meaningful effect on change? So, beginning with the point about that there's very little information out there, I've already covered this in my intro, but the fact that no one knows anything about these atrocities and people naturally don't want to know. Now, we have all, ladies and gentlemen, heard these statistics before. It is simply a lie to say that people do not know that animals, specifically beef and chickens, are harmed. Everyone knows what a battering hen is. Everyone has heard of the problems in Malaysia. The point here is to recognise that the direct way of improving that situation is by putting money into regulation and reform and not simply indirectly doing it by other means by informing everyone first and then pushing it back onto the government to do something. Why not just do it in one quick step? They then spoke about how incredibly effective these types of ads are and he tried to draw an analogy between cigarette campaigns and this issue that we have here. Now, this analogy is completely unfair because in the case of cigarettes, the government is trying to stop people engaging in something that they can't consent to. They are addicted, ladies and gentlemen, whereas in the case of eating meat, we all make a free choice.
Although we all may love black bean beef noodles, I'm not going to rush out of this auditorium at the end of this debate and see if there are any left on the lawn because I'm so addicted to meat. So it's completely ridiculous to say that those two situations are analogous. Moving on to what they said about how currently it's too easy to be removed from the way that meat is killed when we see it on our table. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is fundamentally absolutely ridiculous because the affirmative are trying to tell us that when we sit down at home and look at a steak, we have never considered the fact that it comes from an animal. Surely, when you see it next to your vegetables and you think, these vegetables have come from the ground, we've never thought, it's just completely ridiculous to say that we've never considered where that other thing on the other side of the plate has actually come from. And it's ridiculous to say that we've never considered how that thing actually might come to live and come to die. So these are natural things that we'd like to inquire into, and the worthwhile thing here is putting that information towards reform and regulation, not just some vague notion of everyone being informed and that leading to direct action. Also, they spoke about how despite reducing use, these ads won't actually result in a moral judgment that eating meat is bad. So they tried to claim that these ads are not actually putting a moral imperative on people to not eat meat. Now, do any of us expect to believe that after the first speaker's intro, we were not meant to think that eating meat was bad? He was saying that they were going to be churned up in some sort of blender, and apparently we were actually meant to be indifferent as to whether that was okay or not after that sort of thing. So clearly, the purpose of putting these ads on TV is to make people think that meat is bad. So it's ridiculous to say that it's morally impartial in this case. The third speaker just got up there, interestingly, and brought out all these fancy statistics about CO2 and cows and the amount of methane gas that they produce, etc. And he seemed very happy with himself after this. The first thing here is that these statistics will not be in the ads. It will be the kind of stuff that the first speaker brought up about meats in blenders. It will not be the statistics that were brought up about 10 times the CO. Oh, I can't even repeat that. So, even if they are, if these statistics are in the ads, they'll have absolutely no effect. How many people in this auditorium, other than the Queensland Court, as I said before, actually understood what he was saying about those statistics? So if they're put in the ads, ladies and gentlemen, they will not have the effect that the affirmative team claims was a great thing. The second speaker spoke about the general harms of the meat industry in general and how we're currently using up space that could otherwise be used for crops, etc. Now, the idea that this land could be used to grow crops that could be somehow sent to hungry people in need in third world countries, as they try to characterise, is a really wonderful idea, but it's more akin to a Disney movie than an actual serious debate about this issue. It is not easy to collect and transport crops, and it is not viable to collect and transport crops to those who most need it. Secondly, it is simply not possible in many cases to transfer the land that meat grazes on to land that can be used to grow crops, because much of that land is in rocky and tree-grown areas. Lastly here, on a point about the structure of the ads and how information desperately needs to get out. The speakers, the affirmative has spoken about how they're not actually telling people what to do, it's all about providing the information, and it's this information that's the important thing. However, in reality, ladies and gentlemen, they are effectively telling everyone not to eat meat. Their inform is not just to inform people, but it's actually to put an imperative onto everyone not to eat meat. Now, the reason this is fundamentally unfair is because it's extremely misleading in informing everyone about what is going to lead to change. By telling everyone that simply not picking up a steak at the supermarket will lead to change is absolutely ridiculous, because it is a fact, everyone, ladies and gentlemen, it is a fact that meat will be a part of our future. And simply by a few ads motivating some people not to eat meat, that doesn't mean that there will be no meat practices at all. And so this is the last point that I want to focus on today. It's about the discussion. The discussion that the affirmative claim that these ads will promote, and about how beneficial that will be. Now, the sort of discussion that we require, ladies and gentlemen, is not the one that has happened in the past and is happening now about why eating meat is bad, which has been going on for a long time, and maybe separately a very valuable discussion. But when we're talking about these practices and the bad ways that we kill meat and the possible harmful effects of the meat industry, the important discussion we need to have is one that recognises that meat will be a part of our future. And the affirmative team today have simply failed to recognise that this is a certain situation. It's not just a plausible situation. Meat will be a part of our future. And considering that, ladies and gentlemen, what is the best way to proceed? It is regulation and reform of the meat industry, not just simply informing everyone about something they already know a lot about. We're proud to propose.